The War of the Stray Ear. Ah, the 18th century, a time of powdered wigs, grand naval battles, and apparently ear-related international incidents. Our story begins in 1731 with Captain Robert Jenkins, a British merchant captain sailing the high seas, minding his own business, when he had an unexpected run-in with the Spanish Coast Guards. Now, one would think they'd discuss maritime boundaries or trade routes, but no, things took a turn for the bizarre. The Spanish, not known for their subtlety, decided to send a very pointed message. In a moment of overzealous enforcement, they lopped off poor Jenkins's ear. Ouch! But don't worry, Jenkins didn't just cry ouch and move on. He carefully preserved his severed ear, possibly with some sea salt and a stiff upper lip, and took it back to Britain. Fast forward to 1738. Picture this. Jenkins, ear in hand, literally, standing before the British Parliament. The MPs are ready for a day of mundane legislative duties, but Jenkins has other plans. He dramatically presents his ear, like a Shakespearean actor with the world's oddest prop, claiming the Spanish had wronged him, and by extension, the entire British Empire. Parliament, never one to miss a dramatic opportunity, seized on this and public outrage exploded. They did what? To our Jenkins? Preposterous. Before you could say international diplomacy, Britain declared war on Spain. This conflict, affectionately known as the War of Jenkins's Ear, was less about strategic interests and more about national pride and a very personal vendetta. The war itself was part of the larger War of Austrian Succession, but it all started with one man's ear and a lot of righteous indignation. The Battle of Caransebe's. Picture the scene. It's 1788, and Austrian forces are encamped near Caransebes, preparing for a grand showdown against the Ottoman Empire. However, what was supposed to be a majestic military maneuver quickly turned into an epic comedy of errors. As night fell, the soldiers, tired from their long march and perhaps a bit too fond of their evening rations, found themselves in a bit of a muddle. A few tipsy troops decided to investigate a rumor that the Ottomans had set up camp nearby. In their less than sober state, they stumbled into their own supply line and promptly mistook their own comrades for the enemy. In a scene straight out of a slapstick routine, soldiers started firing at each other, shouting orders to non-existent enemies, and generally creating a battlefield that was less heroic clash and more chaotic circus. The confusion spread like wildfire. Soon, entire regiments were entangled in friendly fire, as if they were in a particularly messy game of dodgeball. By morning, the Ottomans, who had been watching this spectacle from a distance, must have wondered if they'd accidentally wandered into a comedy club rather than a war zone. The battle, which never really took place, ended up being a classic example of how getting drunk on duty can lead to some truly historic missteps. In the end, no actual combat happened. The only casualties were egos and a few bruised soldierly pride. And so, the Battle of Caransebes stands as a testament to how even the most serious of armies can turn into a farcical fiasco when fueled by confusion and a bit too much liquor. The AMU War. Our tale begins in the farmlands of Western Australia, where farmers were facing an invasion of epic proportions. Thousands of EMUs, those large, flightless birds with a penchant for causing trouble, had descended upon their crops, creating havoc. The farmers, desperate and out of options, turned to the government for help. And what does the government do when faced with such a feathered menace? They send in the military, of course. Enter Major GPW. Meredith and his squad, armed with machine guns and an unshakable belief in their mission to protect the nation's wheat. What followed was a campaign that can only be described as a comedy of military miscalculations. The EMUs, with their superior speed and agility, quickly proved to be more than a match for the soldiers. Imagine, if you will, the sight of heavily armed men chasing after birds that seemed to have a sixth sense for dodging bullets. It was like a real-life game of cat and mouse, or rather, man and bird. Despite their best efforts, the soldiers found themselves outmaneuvered at every turn. The EMUs would scatter in small groups, making it nearly impossible to get a clear shot. When one EMU was taken down, another would pop up, as if to mock the futility of the whole endeavor. Major Meredith himself noted that the EMUs could face machine guns with the invulnerability of tanks. After several weeks of fruitless pursuit and mounting frustration, the government decided it was time to cut their losses. The military withdrew, defeated by a foe they could neither outsmart nor outrun. The EMUs, victorious, returned to their roaming, leaving behind a tale that would become the stuff of legend. The Great Mu War, as it came to be known, is a quirky chapter in Australian history. It's a reminder that sometimes, even the best-laid plans can be outwitted by nature's simplest creatures. The Great Mu Inscription. Let's take a step back in time to ancient Egypt, a civilization known for its monumental architecture, advanced science, and, as it turns out, a bit of birdwatching gone awry. Our story begins with the priests and scholars of the time, who were always on the lookout for divine signs and portents. And what did they stumble upon one fateful day? Mysterious, elongated footprints crisscrossing the desert sands. These weren't just any footprints. They belonged to the EMU, a bird that had wandered far from its native lands. But to the Egyptians, unfamiliar with the creature, these tracks were nothing short of a celestial enigma. They believed the gods were trying to communicate with them through these cryptic symbols, and thus the Great Mu Inscription saga began. Imagine the scene. Revered priests and scholars, adorned in their finest robes, gathered around the divine emu tracks. They debated and theorized, each trying to outdo the other with increasingly elaborate interpretations. Was it a message of prosperity? A warning of impending doom? Or perhaps a divine mandate to build another pyramid? The possibilities were as endless as the desert itself. In their earnestness, they decided to immortalize these tracks in stone. Artisans were summoned to meticulously carve the EMU footprints onto grand tablets, creating what they believed to be sacred inscriptions. The scholars worked tirelessly, attempting to decode the heavenly hieroglyphs and unlock the secrets they held. Little did they know, they were simply trying to make sense of a bird's wandering. This went on for years, with generations of scribes dedicating their lives to the study of these enigmatic markings. Libraries were filled with scrolls detailing various theories, each more far-fetched than the last. The inscriptions became a cornerstone of religious study, a testament to the priests' devotion and perhaps their overactive imaginations. It wasn't until much later, with the advent of more widespread exploration and natural history studies, that the true origin of the tracks was discovered. The realization that these divine messages were just the random wanderings of an emu must have been a humbling moment for the scholars of the time. But it also serves as a delightful reminder of how even the wisest among us can be led astray by a simple misunderstanding. The Pastry War. Next tale takes us to the heart of a deliciously absurd conflict, the Pastry War of 1838. Picture this. The bustling streets of Mexico City, where a French pastry chef named Monsieur Remontel set up shop, delighting locals with his exquisite confections. Life was sweet, until a group of hungry Mexican officers decided to sample his goods without paying, leaving behind a trail of crumbs and chaos. Monsieur Remontel, understandably outraged, sought compensation for the damages. But instead of an apology or a few pesos, he received nothing but crumbs of justice. The poor chef took his case to the Mexican government, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. Not one to be dismissed, Remontel turned to a higher power, the French government. France, ever the defender of its culinary pride, was more than willing to champion the cause of a beleaguered pastry chef. With a flair for the dramatic, they demanded an exorbitant sum of 600,000 pesos in reparations, a fortune at the time. When Mexico refused to pay, France did what any rational nation would do over a croissant. They declared war. In December of 1838, French forces blockaded Mexican ports and bombarded the fortress of San Juan de Ulua. The Mexican government, caught between a rock and a hard pastry, was forced to take the conflict seriously. Skirmishes ensued, with the French advancing and the Mexicans resisting with all their might, all for the honor of one man's bakery. As the conflict dragged on, it became clear that this wasn't just about a pastry shop anymore. The Pastry War highlighted larger issues between France and Mexico, including unpaid debts and national pride. But through it all, the image of a pastry chef's ruined shop remained a symbol of the absurdity that had sparked the flames of war. Finally, in March of 1839, after months of pastry-fueled hostilities, an agreement was reached. Mexico agreed to pay 600,000 pesos in damages, and the French forces withdrew, their mission accomplished. Monsieur Remontel's honor and his bakery were restored, and the world learned a valuable lesson about the lengths to which the French will go to defend their cuisine. The War of the Oaken Bucket. Medieval Italy, a land of fierce rivalries, grand castles, and one very contentious bucket. Yes, you heard that right. Our story takes us to the early 14th century, where the cities of Modena and Bologna were embroiled in a feud that culminated in the War of the Oaken Bucket. The year was 1325. Modena and Bologna had been rivals for years, their tensions simmering over politics, territory, and just about anything else. But what truly set things ablaze was an incident involving a simple wooden bucket. Legend has it that Modenese soldiers, in a bold and cheeky move, snuck into Bologna and stole a bucket from the city's central well. Now, this wasn't just any bucket. It was a symbol of communal pride in daily life. For the Bolognese, the theft was an unforgivable affront. How dare those Modenese scoundrels swipe their beloved bucket? Outrage ensued, and what began as a petty act of theft escalated into a full-scale war. The Bolognese mobilized their forces and marched towards Modena, determined to retrieve their stolen symbol of pride. What followed was the Battle of Zappolino, one of the largest battles of the era, fought by thousands of soldiers over, you guessed it, a bucket. The clash was fierce, with knights clanging swords, arrows flying, and both sides fighting with the fervor usually reserved for holy relics. But despite their best efforts, the Bolognese forces were defeated, and the Modenese retained their ill-gotten trophy. The bucket, now a symbol of their victory, was paraded around Modena in triumph. Years passed, and the War of the Oaken Bucket became legendary. The bucket itself was kept in Modena as a cherished relic, a testament to their cunning and the absurdity of the conflict. To this day, a replica of the infamous bucket is displayed in the city's town hall, a quirky reminder of the lengths people will go to defend their honor and their buckets. The Pig War. Imagine an idyllic island in the Pacific Northwest, where lush forests meet the sparkling sea. It's 1859, and the stage is set for one of history's most peculiar conflicts, the Pig War. Our tale begins on San Juan Island, where American settlers and British subjects coexisted in a somewhat uneasy peace, each claiming the land as their own. One sunny June morning, an American farmer named Lyman Cutler awoke to find his prized potato patch had been ransacked. The culprit? A particularly adventurous British-owned pig. Infuriated, Cutler did what any self-respecting farmer would do. He shot the pig. Little did he know, this seemingly small act would set off a chain of events leading to an international standoff. Charles Griffin, the pig's owner, demanded compensation for his beloved swine. Cutler offered $10, which Griffin deemed an insult. With tensions already high between the American and British settlers, the situation quickly escalated. British authorities threatened to arrest Cutler, prompting the Americans to call for military support. Soon, both nations had troops stationed on the island, ready for battle, all over one pig. As American and British soldiers dug in, preparing for a showdown, cooler heads began to prevail. Both sides were keenly aware that a war over a pig would be, well, rather embarrassing. Negotiations began, with neither side willing to back down, but also unwilling to fire the first shot. For weeks, the two camps faced off, trading barbs and bluster, but thankfully, no bullets. The soldiers, it seems, were more interested in camaraderie than conflict. Stories abound of them visiting each other's camps, sharing meals, and even playing games. The so-called Pig War had turned into a bizarre, peaceful standoff, with the only casualty being the unfortunate pig that started it all. Finally, after several months of this absurd standoff, higher authorities intervened. General Winfield Scott of the United States and Governor James Douglas of Vancouver Island met and agreed to a peaceful resolution. Both nations would maintain a small, symbolic presence on the island until a permanent boundary could be established. In 1872, an international arbitration finally settled the border, and San Juan Island was declared American territory. And what of the pig? Though it didn't live to see the peaceful outcome it inadvertently brokered, it became a legend, remembered as the unwitting instigator of the most good-natured war in history.